Shamil has an immensely varied background doing economics, philosophy, setting up five hedge funds, several of which were multi-billion-dollar funds. Also a long-standing contributor within the areas of philanthropy and social impact investing, including as a founding philanthropist for the Global Priorities Institute, of which I'm a part. And so, first question then, yeah, your career's been very varied, incorporating research, finance, philanthropy, and other areas too. What kind of ties all of this together?
Yeah, so as I was saying, I think one theme that I think runs through my interests is what is human well-being? And that's, by its very nature, a multidisciplinary approach. You need to understand the brain, so that's why I was very interested in neuroscience. Because you need to understand the brain's reward mechanisms, the neuroscience of emotions. You need to understand human biology, homeostasis, health, metabolism, philosophy, obviously, how should we act, and psychology, economics, because ultimately what we want is to have a flourishing society with flourishing individuals. So human well-being, I think, is the common theme.
Okay, so the common theme is human well-being, what makes for a good life. What's your kind of overarching view or answer to that question, your broad kind of philosophical framework then?
Yeah, so I think I am slightly broader than, I mean, in terms of a theory of well-being, I take a slightly broader perspective than hedonism, for example. I probably have this kind of objectivist type of approach. And ultimately, I kind of have Aristotelian leanings when it comes to human well-being, when it comes to a theory of the prudential value. But because I think it's got a lot of rich architecture, cultivating dispositions and cultivating your capacities, cultivating neural networks towards the good. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to the moral values, I think you have to take an impartial perspective. So I end up being a consequentialist. I guess a consequentialist with a broader theory of welfare. Mm-hmm. Is the basic idea.
Yeah, and just to clarify, for those that don't know, what is a kind of Aristotelian conception of the good life compared to hedonism?
Yeah, so I think the Aristotelian human flourishing concept, sometimes called eudaimonia, is richer than just pleasure. I mean, it's about developing the right motivations, including moral motivations. And you end up with this kind of concept of human flourishing, of good life, which incorporates many of the values, like you'd find on an objective list, like not just pleasure, but knowledge and accomplishments and richer, deep human relations, as well as, of course, justice and other virtues.
Okay, so a much kind of thicker conception of well-being. And how does that interplay with EA then?
Right.
So, yeah, what do you think that has for the question of what causes are most important, for example?
Okay, that's really the kind of operative question. I think in a way, it doesn't. The impact is not as large as you might think because suffering, illness, extreme poverty, death. These are things that destroy human flourishing. And so I think in our current, they're going to dominate. I think even so until we kind of sort out these things, get rid of these scourges, I think it makes no difference at all. Perhaps in the future it might. I mean, perhaps in the distant future, I think it might be different because in the distant future, may have the possibility of, we might want to, it might make a difference whether we organize society on the basis of allowing having an environment which is conducive to human flourishing, or an environment which is simply designed to maximize pleasure.
Yeah. Okay. So you wouldn't be so excited about the hedonium shockwave where just everyone's in a perfect bliss state for the rest of eternity.
You know, the thing is that it's interesting. You know, the experience machine. My view is in practice, it just doesn't. It's not as robust.
Yeah. Okay.
And I'm all in favor of pleasure. Yeah. I just think that
aren't we all?
we've weaved into a complex network.
Yeah.
Where you know, lots of instrumental goods like virtues and things like that is going to make it more robust. So pleasure for things that you would desire in a way that kind of, you know, you've developed yourself as a person, doing the right things. For example, aiming yourself towards the good, including increasing the flourishing of others.
Yeah. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. And I think we can, on that, let's turn to kind of how that's then impacted your philanthropy and your kind of, you know, impact investing as well. And for those, you know, in the audience, as you answer questions, remember the kind of Bizzabo app. You can submit questions kind of as we go along. So, okay, in terms of impact investing and philanthropy, you know, you have been a major philanthropist kind of for many years, including before you encountered the ideas of effective altruism. So can you tell us a bit about what were the sorts of things you were funding then, and how do you feel about those donations now?
Yeah. Look, I mean, actually, as a kind of trained economist, I always had the view that my donations should have the kind of, you know, should be seeking to maximize marginal utility. And so, in a way, I kind of already had implicitly some EA-friendly principles. For example, like not going into crowded areas. And I used to, you know, some of the things that I used to do was funding schools for slum children in India, funding diabetes and obesity research, some social finance initiatives. And I think, you know, generally that's fine. But through talking to you and Toby Ord and Ben Todd, you know, I think at some stage I became kind of quite shocked at the idea that the average charity, you could do 2 orders of magnitude better by funding a top charity compared to an average one, and that was just a shock. And so I think that's given, you know, I feel the moral weight of that now when I think about opportunities, because you know, I was thinking about it before, but I thought, well, it's all very marginal, but it's not very marginal.
Yeah, yeah. I think you're actually one of the few kind of, many big philanthropists have often, you know, they come into EA because they haven't made commitments in other areas before. You're kind of one of the rare exceptions where you've like actually really pivoted kind of where your focus areas have been. And one of those things has been to, you know, being a founding donor to the Global Priorities Institute. So what was kind of some of your reasons behind that, thinking about that?
Yeah. Well, look, it's been a real honor to be able to help to fund, you know, Global Priorities Institute, because I think there is a really strong case to be made for that. There's also a case against, which I'll come to, and that, you know, give you the kind of the tension and the calculus that you have to go through. But the idea behind Global Priorities Institute is that if one can create a successful institute, that the institute will enhance the intellectual undergirdings of the EA movement. And we already know that the EA movement, Center for Effective Altruism, and many other organizations really make a difference in attracting funds to the sectors and attracting funds and pointing them to more effective causes. So, to my mind, there's a double leverage here. So if we can make the EA community more credible and give it the intellectual rigor, then it's going to flow through to policymakers and really start affecting the whole zeitgeist of public policy. And that's a really strong case. But on the other hand, there's a kind of a case against, which you have to worry, because which is that, well, what if that analysis is wrong? If it's wrong, then it's not going to have a big impact. But the real cost of that is that there has been perhaps a foregone donation of £1 million to the AMF, right? And so there's a moral cost to that. Opportunity, there's a real. So we have to make sure that the calculus is right. And happily, I think the expected utility calculus comes out in favor of the institute.
Okay, and so compare that then to kind of impact investing, which you've also done in the past. Like, how promising do you think impact investing is as a means of doing good? How does that compare to philanthropy, do you think?
Yeah, so I think social finance and impact investing is a really interesting area, and it's very hot at the moment, and for the last few years. But I think there's a tension between finance first and impact first. What's the objective here? And I think sometimes there is an arbitrage, so you can have your cake and eat it, and people can get good expected returns and also have a big impact. But mostly, I think that there is a trade-off, and it could be biting to a greater or lesser extent. And if you do have this trade-off, then you have to kind of think through, what's the value of the subsidy to expected return? And that value of the subsidy to expected return, then you have to say, well, if that was a pure donation, would it do more good? And so it's just about the calculations, to my view. I mean, most of what I did was impact first, sort of zero interest loans to charity. And there, you see, I think that, I think there can be interesting value because sometimes there are market imperfections, quantity restrictions. Like, for example, so impact lending, for example, could potentiate the donations that the charities already have, just make them more powerful. So, and that could be quite a big effect. And the foregone interest would be much smaller than the potentiation of the existing donations. So there is an interesting, another way that impact investing can be beneficial is if it just brings a huge sum of capital to bear, much bigger than would have been the donation or the implied subsidy value if given as a donation. So my view is that you've got to do the calculations. However, I now think that there's enough money in that area. It's very crowded. Any opportunities are already mostly being sought out because people are interested in financial return. So actually, you're better off focusing on pure impact.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing how many impact investors I talk to who really, really believe that you can get just a market kind of financial return while having a really big impact, which just doesn't make any sense to me.
It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense in equilibrium. There are situations where there's such a disequilibrium that I'm sure,
yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure of the analysis, but maybe Mohammed Yunus, these early results that they got in Bangladesh, maybe they got good financial returns and they did good. But I think that mostly there is a trade-off.
Yeah. And so relatedly then, your hedge funds, question from the audience, they were just about maximizing financial return, is that right, rather than impact?
I mean, that was just providing a service for the market.
Okay. Okay, so what then, the theme of the conference is kind of intellectual exploration within effective altruism. What do you think are the most important kind of open questions within effective altruism, things that we haven't resolved yet?
Yeah. So I think that, to my mind, the biggest open question is the importance of the long-term future. I think on many, but not all, philosophical views, the long-term future could actually completely dominate the current generation, and actually I'm personally very swayed by that. I think that it really is very important, but we really need to get this right, because there'll be lots of shifting of resources, so we need to think through, and it's in a way how to deal with moral uncertainty. If it wasn't just so dominant in terms of the mathematics of it all, through the long-term future, it would be easier, because you could make these easier trade-offs. But I do think that it's something that we need to think through and get right, and and hopefully find the right balance.
Okay. And I guess kind of relatedly, is there anything, kind of asking from the audience, anything that you think is kind of going badly wrong in effective altruism, or mistakes that might be being made?
So that's, yes, but it's inevitable, because unintended consequences just abound in economics. I mean, if you look at welfare economics, that's exactly, all over economics, that's just the way these things work. And what we have to do is we have to think through the issues very carefully and get as much evidence as possible so we can minimize these cases. And if you look at healthcare, mistakes happen from time to time, but we want to learn from them and make sure that we have procedures in place to kind of minimize these things. And just because mistakes happen, it doesn't mean that you don't treat. So we were chatting about this earlier, right? It's sort of, is it right to have a Hippocratic oath, do no harm? Well, actually, no, it's not right, because do no harm would imply infinite risk aversion, and that's just not rational.
Okay, so then,
Do you agree?
I mean, of course I agree, yeah. I mean, in practice, I think, be really, really reticent about, anything that does harm. If you're doing kind of, well, ends justify the means reasoning, you've probably gone astray. But the idea of just some people then say, no, the first moral principle should be do no harm, and then only within that. But then you end up doing absolutely nothing. In fact, you should just kill yourself, because anything you do has some chance of harming other people. Which is, I guess, a way of weeding out that view from philosophy, but perhaps not the most rational way of doing so.
But there are philosophers who kind of have this view.
I mean, sometimes, yeah. Sometimes you can get absolutists. Okay, a really interesting question from the audience is about your Aristotelianism, where, okay, you talked about applying that to humans. What about the application of that to non-human animals and, future sentient AI and so on?
Very, very good. I use the word human flourishing, but in fact, I definitely want to use the word flourishing. And in a way, I would say it's even more applicable to non-human species, because actually that's how Aristotle, got the idea from, what is a flourishing, what is a flower that flourishes, is doing well. So allowing the species, in a way, the real problem is applying it to humans, because there we got these kind of, we've strayed from our evolution, the normative concepts have strayed from the evolutionary value function, right? Whereas for animals, if they're not able to, I don't know, an animal whose nature is to run around, and if they're not able to run around, that's not conducive to their flourishing. In terms of, on the other side, beyond humans and other sentient, sentient forms of existence, I've been thinking about that a lot, and I think it's a tough one, but
yeah, it's kind of a challenge, because the whole idea is that there's this like nature or design. So would it mean that like we design some, and having a good life is fulfilling your purpose? So if we design the AI to do a certain thing, is its good life filling whatever we told it to do?
So I have this view that ultimately our values are things like happiness and accomplishments and knowledge, and ultimately we're interested in things like knowledge because we had an evolutionary bent to go towards it, but now we've made now we choose to, as this is a value for us, because artificial agents may be designed from scratch and may have no evolutionary baggage. Is it going to be around their reward function, or is there something that we're all missing that, it's all about massive information processing, and the more they can, the more free energy, islands of negative entropy that they can create, the better, or something like, we don't know. But I think it's a tough question.
Yeah, okay.
But I do think that the idea of there's less of a discontinuity between non-human species and humans with the human flourishing model, and it could potentially be extended to the other way. So I'm kind of interested in that.
Yeah, I mean, this is just something I hadn't thought about before this minute ago, but you design a paperclip maximizer, and that's meant to be this like terrible universe. But then on your view, it seemed like, well, it's fulfilling its purpose of
but it's a very
paperclips.
But that kind of flourishing would be very thin. I mean, very narrow. I mean, it would be not the kind of rich, complex networks that humans have, for example, or even that other mammals would have. They have very rich, complex, interesting lives.
Yeah. Okay. I'm glad. Okay, a couple of questions about kind of AI and DeepMind. So kind of overall, what do you think about DeepMind's current direction? You're kind of involved in them as a corporate strategist, and is there other things you disagree with in terms of what they're doing? Or, if you're allowed to say.
So I think actually DeepMind is an amazing place, and it's a wonderful culture for to try to bring about AGI. I think one of the things that's interesting for this audience is that AI safety and ethical issues are right at the center of DeepMind. I mean, this is incredible for a corporate, incredible for a corporate, and that's why I think I mean it's incredible. So right now there's a new ethics and society group at DeepMind, just to see the impact that AI will have on society. DeepMind's also a founding partner of the Partnership for AI, but there's a really strong technical AI safety group, which I think we heard from Victoria, and so it's in a way probably one of the most I think it's amazing what's happened. 3 years ago, almost 3 years ago, we had Puerto Rico, AI conference in Puerto Rico, and I was just chatting with someone here to see what a huge difference 3 years has made. AI safety has gone from kind of a kooky idea, as you said it, to really, really mainstream, where many of the large corporates, and I think DeepMind is probably leading here, have it as a central place. So I feel pretty good, and I think it's a very interesting area, and there's a real sense of responsibility.
Okay, fantastic. And yeah, final question then, before we run out of time. In terms of AI and flourishing and bringing those two together, like how do you feel like, what are the most important things to focus on, do you think, in terms of ensuring that AI does lead to the flourishing of sentient creatures?
So again, I think that my answer wouldn't differ from a hedonistic utilitarian. Because I think that on the bad side of things, pretty much, you know, most views are agreed that, for example, human extinction or you know, massive technological unemployment or all of these things are going to be a problem. I take the view that, of course, we need to make sure that we don't have any very low probability events like a human extinction. That's, you know, has like an overwhelming moral case. But I think that we also need to be very clear about how it's going to impact society, jobs, meaning. I mean, it's not just, so there's some very interesting things. You know, we know that people don't just work for income, they work for a sense of meaning. And, you know, one of the most worrying things is, you know, will there be some sort of temporary destruction of meaning? You know, how will society cope with that? So there's short-term problems and, of course, you know, long-term problems on this.
Okay, cool. Well, let's all put our hands together to thank Shamil for